from different points of view to come closer to truth. So hence, the dialectic has its basis in, it has a classical basis. And then we looked at uh, Hegel's views on aesthetics. And to begin that, we talked about his idea on work. So work is, uh, as Hegel says, is an expression of the absolute spirit, who you are. And we took up the example of the maid who cooks, and in so on the same lines, he says that, art is also an expression of the absolute spirit. So, but since it is an expression of the absolute spirit, it also falls into the notions of being historical, and that it moves dialectically. And hence art is not mimetic, as we looked up in during Neoplatonism, not Neoclassicism. Yes, so art becomes an expression of spirit, and this is, as you pointed out, becomes a very romantic idea, is which uh, which is very closely associated with Wordsworth's theory of poetry and his notion of spontaneity that we have already talked about. And then we saw that then you talked about a very critical aspect of this notion of uh, art being an expression of spirit, that art becomes one of the stages of this whole, because art is uh, moves dialectically, it becomes part of a journey towards truth. So it becomes obsolete in some sense. And then we also talked about how art supersedes history, but it is superseded by religion and philosophy. And this philosophy is especially a bourgeois enlightenment philosophy. And uh, then we talked about the need of art. Yes, and there we talked about how art is a form of work or art as a form of duplication of oneself, that I didn't get, so you'll have to repeat that for me. And then we looked at how art moves in historical ways, as Hegel points out. And there are three phases he talks about. The first being the basic phase, where you had the symbolic art, where spirit was embodied everywhere. So you had trees, sun, and wind as your gods. Like you looked up God in those uh, natural or nature. And in the second phase, you give a human form to these uh, earlier uh, things that you call gods. And there is a sort of there is an anthropomorphic view of the world, and towards like perceiving God. Yes. And this is, as you pointed out, was classical art, especially Greek classical art, where the spirit expresses itself as human form. And in the third phase, you have the romantic form of art, uh, where you have the Christian idea of spirit. And uh, man, okay, I don't remember what succeeded that. Yeah, that's what we discussed. Like we ended up with these three phases.
Yeah. So very good, very well summarized. The one or two important points you have left out. One is that art is autonomous in terms of freedom, right? It is not bound by anything like thought or by ethical judgments, right? Or philosophy. So, in some sense, he believes he follows Kant here. Kant's idea of autonomy and freedom that art provides. And like Kant, he also emphasizes the role of imagination, intuition, emotions in art as against something like thoughts and ideas of philosophy, right? So these are very important things that you should keep in mind. In some sense, he's continuing Kant's ideas. right? So one of the reasons why I discussed Kant at length is because he is such an important influence on later philosophy like Hegel's philosophy, right? And 2 points which you said you didn't understand. One is the idea of replication, right? And by replication, it only means it's an expression of spirit. Now, the term Geist implies spirit as well as mind. So, as in the work, art also expresses human self. In that sense, it is a replication, right? And then, as you pointed out, yeah.
So what term did you say just now?
What
The
term?
term dash represents something something. I mean, I misheard
Yeah,
probably.
yeah. He's talking about replication of how art is replication of something. So I said that was his query. He didn't understand. So the book by Hegel that we had talked about is Phenomenology of Geist. Now, Geist means mind as well as spirit, right? There is some ambiguity there. So some translator translate it as phenomenology of spirit, and for some it is mind. So Geist, G-E-I-S-T, not G-I-E-S-T. Stavan, G-E-I-S-T, Geist. Right? Yeah. So replication of what? Then like work, art is also an expression of the spirit. In that sense, it's a replication of the self, right? Self as the spirit. That's what we talked about. That was the Digvijay's query. And he was also not very clear about Christian metaphors here. And now, if we see art as expression, then on one hand, it's higher than nature, but it is lower than religion and philosophy. Because philosophy is the highest grasping of subject as substance in a concrete form. That is the absolute that you grasp through philosophy. And religion is a higher dimension of closer towards truth. So in Hegel, you have to remember it's all linear development, right? Historical progress. So by progress, you mean at a particular point in history, art or freedom or even ethics or whatever you are discussing is ahead of something, and it is still incomplete, and there is still something that is better than that. So art is higher than nature, but it is not higher than religion or philosophy. So you can see a hierarchy of expression of spirit, right? So art is one of the modes through which spirit or the absolute mind expresses itself. So the idea of historical progress is the key to understand everything. And then obviously there would be stages of expression. So the earliest expression of Geist was in the form of what he calls the symbolic phase, where spirit, the God, was found in everything which does not resemble human beings. Right? So trees were imagined as divine, rivers were called mothers, and so on and so forth, right? Sun, moon are understood as God. So that is what he calls symbolic phase of artistic expression. That is the phase, that's the period in history. Now that is negated to higher form, where there is human body becomes one of the forms of expression, right? And it corresponds to the second moment of dialectic, of antithesis, right? Like you recognize yourself as not being something else. So human form is that period which he calls the classical, where gods were imagined, or the divinity was imagined, or the spirit was imagined as having human form. And third phase is what he calls the romantic, where the spirit expresses itself as something which transcends human form, as well as the symbolic. And the parallels that he draws are from Christianity. saying how the earliest forms are pantheistic, like the Vedic religion. The second phase is classical, where you started building idols. And the third phase is when poetry and music and painting becomes main forms of expression. And he says that during the earliest phase, symbolic phase, architecture was the form of art that was closest to the spirit of the times. And this is where also the term digest, right? Zeitgeist implies the spirit of the times. Zeitgeist, have you heard of this phrase? Anybody? Zeitgeist, Zeitgeist.
Yes,
Zeitgeist implies the spirit of times, right? And it goes back to find its expression in Hegel particularly. So Zeitgeist of the symbolic period is artistic form of architecture where there are no human forms. The second is when it becomes anthropomorphic, where human forms are taken up, and that is the classical phase where sculpture becomes the most important form. And the third phase, that is romantic phase, is when painting, music, and poetry become the most prominent form of artistic expression. And for him, this corresponds to the idea of Holy Ghost in Christianity, right? So the earliest religions are pantheistic. Then you had the classical religions like Greek and Romans, where God was imagined in a human form, right? Zeus, sculptures one day, for example. And the highest form of religion is Christianity. Why? Because it has the idea of Holy Ghost, right? And the manifestation of Holy Ghost is the Son, that is the Christ, who incarnates or takes a human manifestation of God. So for him, Christianity is a kind of pinnacle of religious development. And the idea of Trinity is very important in Catholicism, is also very important to Hegelian thought, because his understanding of dialectic is influenced by the Christian idea of Trinity, right? So this is the third phase of art, and he believes that poetry suits the digest of the period. And he says painting, music, and poetry can be laid out in a linear way. So painting is the visualized form of expression of visuals. Music is the expression of sound, and poetry combines both, right? So you can imagine painting being negated by music, and both find a higher unity in poetry, right? So you can see how dialectical explanation of art is very important here. And we also discussed, if you remember, that art is seen as largely as sensuous idea. By sensuous, you mean it appeals to senses, but at the same time, it's a concept, and content and form are united. Content, that is idea, and form are united in a concrete way. Yes, poetry is a synthesis of painting and music. So you can see at every stage, he does not consider something as a fixed, but things are seen to be as a unfolding dialectically to thesis, antithesis, and synthesis. So these are some of the important ideas of Hegel that we were talking about. And if you look on page 406, then he talks about the point that Stavani is talking about, right? How poetry is seen as the highest form of expression, which is most suited to romanticism. And the question that Digvijay mentioned was also about obsolescence. By obsolescence, you mean that art was very important at a particular phase of history of expression of spirit. So art was extremely important in early history, but slowly it seems to have what should I say, being replaced by more advanced or progressed forms of expression like religion and philosophy. So in some sense, religion and philosophy make art obsolete. So the idea of death of art is a very important idea here. Yeah, so now let's take questions that Jaldi wants to ask. And then who else had a question? Let's start with Jaldi.
Sir, I have one after Jalathi.
Yeah. Jaldi Tiksha can.
So mine is text related
Hmm.
to some extent. So if you flip to page number 392, there on that page the master slave example is discussed. Now what we discussed, I'm sorry, but I could not relate what we discussed to that text. Like they're talking about taking each other's lives, and that's fine. But in the first paragraph,
Fine.
no, I mean,
Okay. Yeah, go ahead.
yeah, in the second half of the first paragraph, uh, in the inverted commas, it is only through taking one's life that freedom is won. That the individual proves that his essential being is not imprisoned in the immediate form of individual existence. In seeking the other's death, the individual shows that he values the other person no more than himself. That is his essential being. So that would mean that to prove that their consciousness is independent of immediate individuality, they'd have to take the opposite person's life. Wouldn't they have to take their own life to prove that?
So yeah. So which they consider at par, means that is the moment of taking risk, right? So when you are engaged in a struggle or an agon, agon, that's the Greek word for struggle, right? So in that wrestling bout, what happens is that in individuality would mean that we are not expression, we don't relate to ourselves as spirit, absolute. We relate to ourselves as individual consciousness, not the consciousness in absolute terms. So you have to transcend, negate your individual existence, right? And the reason why you are willing to take other person's life is you see that the spirit can transcend individuality, right? So individual's death does not necessarily mean the death of the spirit. That is what is meant. So it's about taking risk. But if you kill another person, actually, you won't recognize yourself. You would lose your selfness. That is the basic conflict. On one hand, you want to reduce the other person to an object, but at the same time, you cannot. And to reduce somebody as an object, you have to take away that person's consciousness. And if you take away person's consciousness, then how will that person call you a master or a servant? You will lose your self-identity, right? So in order to transcend, so one person gives up taking this risk, right? And that person becomes the bondsman or the slave, while the other wins the battle by taking risk. Now, actual killing does not happen. That is what I'm trying to say.
Yes. So the master, if suppose we just assume that actual killing happens, just for the sake of understanding, then the master dies and the slave survives. And
which is not possible, no? Then how will slave become slave? Who he is?
okay.
So that is the conflict. I'm talking where conflict means there is desire and there is also opposite. Conflict कब आता है? When there is opposite as well as desire, दोनों. Right? You want to eat cake, but you are afraid of putting on weight. That's the conflict. Right? So conflict is desire plus opposition in some way. right? So master-slave dialectic is about the conflict at the second stage of dialectic, right? And this is where Stavan is asking power or social relations are about these dialectics, right? About masters. So basically, you want to own property, right? You want to make your property your own, but then you cannot build your property without using somebody's labor. Stavan, this is for you, right? You cannot build Antilla without workers. Yeah, so you have to rely on someone. So there is deep. So sociality is the basis of consciousness. That means consciousness cannot exist independently of the other, but at the same time, the other cannot also be independent of your consciousness. ऐसा ये duality है, ये opposition है. It's paradoxical that you need to have somebody to call a father, right? But at the same time, you want your father to be more like you, right? But at the same time, unlike you. That person has to be your father, so he has to be unlike you. So there is this conflict, whether it's masculine, feminine, or whether it is master, servant, or wherever you see conflict in society, it's usually about this, that you need other countries to be India. But that other country is also trying to dominate you like you are trying to dominate the other country. I hope I'm making myself clear.
Yes, sir. It's just that.
Yeah. So you have to get that each consciousness is doing what you are doing, right? The other consciousness does not want you to exist, but needs you.
Also, by consciousness, we mean any individual's consciousness, self-consciousness.
Awareness of certain form.
Yes.
So, in order to be aware, you should have the other to be aware of. You have to be aware of something, right?
Something to be, okay. Yes.
You cannot be just aware. You are aware of something. And you can see all sociality is the basis of consciousness.
Yes.
By sociality, you mean this need for the other, dependency, contingency on the other is sociality, right?
Yes.
I'm also responding to Stavan's question here.
Also, sir, write down the page. And the last paragraph, I think somewhere in the middle, it is in fact the slave rather than the master who approaches the truth of independent self-consciousness, etc., etc. So he suggests, what I understood is that by putting his life into danger, by putting his life at stake, facing this absolute fear, does this slave realize, shaken to his foundations, as he puts it, realize the idea of his work, I think. Right. So is this influenced in a way sort of by what Burke called a lot of I forgot that term, I have written it down, but overwhelming of senses, I think, the sublime, the idea of sublime. Is it that? Is it somehow related? Was it influenced? I don't know. It just seems like this.
No. But you can see this absolute fear. And interestingly, what Hegel has to say about sublime is also something that we need to look up. It's not there in Habib. Because he's relying so much on Kant. You can find, I think, some ideas of sublime. But here it is not about sublime. And it's not closer to Burke. Burke is talking about unpleasantness, right? If you remember correctly.
Yes.
Unpleasantness aspect of sublime. Beauty pleases, but sublime threatens.
Pleasures in a negative, yeah.
Yeah, negative pleasure, unpleasantness. So he's not talking about that. He's talking about fear. of losing consciousness itself, right?
All right. Right.
Yeah.
Also, on the later pages, somewhere, there is this idea on page number 395 to be exact. There
Yeah.
is idea of noble consciousness and base consciousness that
Yeah.
he relates to the the feudal structure and all of that. I didn't quite catch.
Good. Thanks for asking. I wanted to talk about it, but I missed it somehow. Noble consciousness would be the master's consciousness. So there are two attitudes in master and slave, right? Towards wealth, power, and state. One is the noble consciousness, which is aligned with state power. Yeah, master in short. And there is base consciousness, which has tendency to rebel against the state power. So rebelliousness is characteristic of base consciousness. And strangely, right? He is writing this from at has failed, right? So early part of French Revolution, Hegel was celebrating very famously with his very close friend called Hölderlin, Holderin. They planted a tree called Tree of Liberty and they danced around it. ऐसी कहानी है, Hegel and Hölderlin. So they celebrated freedom of French Revolution, but slowly everybody knew what happened, right? So there is an ambivalence here. So probably what Habib is suggesting here is that the base consciousness is the beginning of the bourgeois rebelliousness. And strangely, Hegel does not seem to, for some reason, be completely democratic. In the sense, I don't know, means he considers this bourgeois democracy as the pinnacle of something, right? But he seems to have celebrated Napoleon, whom he calls the world historical figure, when he saw Napoleon in Vienna, Jena, where he was studying, and so on. But the base consciousness seems to indicate, says Habib here, how feudal nobility loses its power to the new enterprising bourgeoisie. That's probably what he is indicating. But this is a very interesting aspect.
So so there are parts of consciousness, and each one of them has a base consciousness and a noble consciousness. Again, reflecting the conflict between, opposite kinds of consciousness.
Master and wandsman.
Yes. Okay. Yes, I think that is that for now. When I read further, I'll probably.
Yes, sir. So we were talking about the three forms of the three stages, rather. The first one being the symbolic art, the second one being the classical art, and the third one being the romantic form of art. And simultaneously, we also discussed how art, how poetry is the synthesis of the two art forms, which is like music and painting. And somewhere while you were explaining this to us, you mentioned antithesis and all. So, sir, is it right to say that the first stage could be synthesis and the second could be antithesis and the third one, romantic form, is synthesis? Or where is that antithesis coming from? Since we're talking of it in a dialectic sense of the term.
See, it seems, right, and this is the question that is open-ended right from the time, I think Jaldi raised it first, and later even Digvijay asked it. That thesis, antithesis, synthesis, then this synthesis becomes a new thesis, right? So it seems to go on, right? But at certain time, he seems also to indicate that his period is the highest form of anything, right?
Yes.
So you can say that that is the point of synthesis, but then it can also lead to other negations of that synthesis, right? So where does dialectic stop? Now that is a question. Hegel also famously posited, along with end of art, end of history, something that Fokema takes up in 1990s. The idea of end of history here means that the history not as sequence of events, but search for the right form of government. And for him, the liberal democratic government is the highest, most evolved form of government. So right from beginning, we were searching for the most free expression of rationality, right? And that would be the liberal democracy. So that's where, according to Hegel, his own period, history ended. Now that sounds very strange, right? History कब ऐसे कैसे end हो सकती है? But so there is a kind of ambivalence in Hegel regarding the dialectical process, whether it is an ongoing infinite process or whether it ends at certain point of time, right? So does that in any way respond to your query, Titiksha?
Yes, sir. I mean, I understood. I mean, I had also raised this question before. Where does it end?
It is ambivalence in Hegel. It is
Yes.
probably unresolved. Somewhere he may have made it clear, but it remains unresolved. Yes, Tavan, what I said was that the three phases of dialectic, three stages, right? The last stage is that of synthesis, can become a point for antithesis for the next stage. So next stage will negate this synthesis and onward it will go. That is also something which is indicated by Hegel. At the same time, he says that his period is the ultimate period of human progress, right? And advancement. That is what it means. Yeah. So there is an ambivalence here. Okay. Yeah, Digvijay. Yes.
Yes,
End
sir.
of
Am I
history
audible?
in this. Yeah. End of history in the sense, Tavan, the search for the best form of government, right? State. First, it was when nobody was free. Then one person was free, and then everybody is free, right? In liberal democracy. So that is end of history because it's end of search for freedom, absolute freedom. So he calls that end of history, something that Dave Fokema would take up and say that after collapse of Soviet Union, liberal, neoliberal state is the end of history. Yeah, we do. We do. You are right, Stavan. Actually, idea of liberal democracy is critiqued by Marx, right? Not so much postmodern, of course, but Marxism as well. Yeah, Digvijay.
Yes, sir. So my question was regarding the notion of art in Hegel. So art as the, like Hegel says that art is the expression of the absolute self and the spirit. And when we look at his notion of the self, it is informed by the other and what is beyond it. And so the notion of identity becomes relational. So my question was, when he says, his idea of self is deeply informed by the other, so art can never be a totally idiosyncratic enterprise. Like any form of art can never be this, totally private or detached from the other sort of expression. And But what also confuses is that, the notion of idiosyncrasy is absent in him because it is informed by, the other. So, like, if you get my question, like, the notion of expression and, the notion of originality, which becomes central to romanticism, so it becomes, contestable in.
Resolving any doubts about Hegel, you have to think dialectically.
Mhm.
So the first stage of art would be maybe where it is only subjective, right? And it ends with absolute objectivity, concrete objectivity, and that is music or poetry. And he gives a very interesting analogy that first you build a temple, right? Then you put the God in it, the figure of God in it, in form of sculpture, and then you worship him with songs and poetry. And this worshipping is a communal exercise where entire society participates in the worship, right?
Mhm.
So it becomes extremely social, but at the same time, it is public. It is concrete in public domain. I hope I am making some clarifying here, right? And all these three stages have to be thought of as linearity.
That I couldn't get you. Like,
We're talking about subjectivity and sociality, right? When you say it's always dependent on other. So first is the stage of immediate consciousness, right?
okay.
And then it becomes you recognize yourself, you recognize that your identity is dependent on the other. That's the second stage of the dialectic. And the third is when you transcend both, sublate both, right? So in terms of art, first is probably the most subjective, what emotions come to you, right? And the second would be when you try to give it a form which others can see. But the third is which combines both emotional and forms together,
Mhm.
right? So that everybody can also experience it in objectivity. And
Yes.
if I remember clearly, he says that Kant talks about aesthetic experience as being subjective, universal, but it experience in subjectivity, right? It has to be
Yes, sir.
grasped as a communal. By communal, I mean of community, right? As a community
Mhm.
objective fact. And that is
Okay.
where music and poetry for him is an expression which exists in community domain. And the analogy I gave was there is a temple. That's the first stage. Then you put the god, and then you worship him through songs and poetry. But you don't do it
Mhm.
individually. You do it as a society. So entire society participates, or entire community participates in that performance of song or poetry. So that is the highest form of artistic expression.
Yes. But so the subjective emotions in the first place, aren't they informed by, uh, they are
No,
definitely informed by, aren't they? Informed by
according
the
to me,
other.
that's the no. That's the simple immediate consciousness.
Okay.
Yes, yeah. When you were born, there were just awareness, right? This is
Mhm.
simple awareness, and then there is this bifurcation and what he calls indifferent diversity, right? You see everything around you. वहाँ पे table है, वहाँ पे somebody is standing, there is wall, but you don't recognize yourself as not that. That's the second stage,
Mhm.
right? That first stage of indifferent diversity, second is of recognition through difference, and third is when there is a higher unity that you have, higher form of identity that you have achieved.
Yes, yes. All right.
So it's not social at all the levels, if that's your question.
Uh, Not social. Like, my question was, like, if we look at a work of art, like a piece of poetry or a or a novel or some sense, as the any work of literature, how will Hegel try to analyze it? it is not an expression, even in the romantic notion of, originality. If it is an expression of something, if a certain poem is an expression of the individual's subjectivity, which is, limited to that one self, and not an, it is detached from the other, like
Like you're
and have
talking
to.
about poetry, right? That's the romantic form.
Mhm.
That's the most evolved form of expression.
Okay, well, I'll have to think more about it. I'll ask you this
Okay,
question later.
let me
Yeah.
respond to it by this way. When you read a poem, right, and you recognize, अरे ये तो Wordsworth की feelings है, right? When you read Daffodils or Solitary Reaper or whatever, but then you recognize it also as your emotions and feelings, right?
Yes,
So
yes.
reader, it reaches out to the reader. So
Mhm.
reader and Wordsworth, there is some sort of common ground that is found between the author and the reader,
Yes.
right? So that
Yes,
is the
sir.
higher form of experience that you get out of art. You can experience someone's emotions as your own.
Yes. Okay, I get it. Get it.
Right.
Yes, sir.
Okay. How does art attain objectivity? Means universal subjectivity is what how does it anything attain objectivity, Stavan? It's when subject is grasped as substance. This looks as pen to everyone. वो ऐसा है जिससे पेन नहीं दिखता है, right? So this is the highest form of objectivity. But it is reached through a process called dialectic. So that is how it is attained. Okay, this is going off track, Stavan. Categorical imperative is the term used by Kant to talk of building ethics based on rationality. Remember, Kant के time पे आता है. And Hegel has problems with that because categorical imperative does not take into consideration historical contingency. Right? It becomes a very abstract idea, according to Hegel. Right? It has to be made concrete. Concreteness is what is wanted, and that is how he also criticizes all Eastern religions, that they talk of Brahma and all that, Allah and all that, but they think about it in very abstract terms. There is no concrete existence for that. So that is an inferior form of religion compared to Christianity, because usme Christ is manifestation, concrete manifestation of the spirit. So Christianity is more evolved than Hinduism and Islam, according to, or Judaism, according to Hegel. इसलिए आपको अगर मारपीट करनी है तो हेगल को जाके मार सकते हो आप, मैं नहीं कह रहा, right? But what it reveals is the politics of Hegel's project, right? It's a political project in the sense that you are saying that the German Western culture and society is the most advanced form of society, right? बाकी African है, बाकी Iranian है, या Chinese है, या Indian है. These are all inferior. So the idea of progress, the bourgeois idea of progress that is at the heart of Hegel's project, seems to put everyone else in what is known as the waiting room of history. Waiting room of history. No, Marx did not say that Asia and Africa are ahistorical. What he said was there is Oriental despotism in India. Right? India did not have a kind of modernity that the Western culture had. They had despotism. He's talking of an Oriental economy, which is a backward form of economy for Marx. No, he considers other parts as backward, Jai. That is the politics. How Eurocentric he is. And you can see that this is also the period of high colonialism, right? 19th century. Colonialism भी काफी powerful था. Sun would never set on British Empire. He is imperialistic, he is colonial, he is Eurocentric. Because progress और advancement किसकी? हमारे society. हम सबसे progressive है. बाकी सब backward है. There is a universalizing tendency in Western thought that what they think is the truth, right? Their way of thinking is the most evolved form of thinking, while others are backward. Yeah, a colonial idea. He's so post-colonial. Somebody has brought this up. Who has brought this up? Stavan must have brought this up. Yes, it is colonialism. So postmodernism and post-colonialism come together in criticizing Hegelian view of history and modernity. If you remember last semester, we started out by discussing modernity, right? And we asked a question whether modernity is a Western phenomenon, right? And whether Westernization equates with modernization. The more Westernized you become, do you become more modern? That is the question that we started out with, right? And it was within this context that we started studying history of literary criticism. And what was not told on the textbook cover was that it's history of Western criticism, right? But Western नहीं है क्योंकि Western है वो universal है, ऐसे belief हो गया है वहाँ पे. So there is a universalism. So Western modernity is a universal modernity. Is the Eurocentric idea of modernity, and Hegel embodies that. Hegel is the classical case of colonial thinking. That we are more advanced than other countries. So in some sense, it also justifies colonialism, if you can see that, right? हम लोग democratic है और आप लोग backward हो. And very interesting case about this whole democracy business is that during colonial period, freedom of expression was guaranteed to all citizens of Britain. But in India, anybody criticizing the government would be charged with sedition. So if you go to Britain and criticize the government, you are not charged with sedition. But if you come to India and criticize government, you are charged with sedition. So there are double standards about this democracy. So it is white man's democracy. Humanism, progress. So all the parameters of progress, humanism, modernity are deeply connected to the politics of colonialism. Doubt that India is a democracy. America was democracy, right? At one time. Okay, so this is Hegel for you. So what are your responses? Now you should be reading up whatever we have discussed. क्यों weird क्यों लग रहा है? Weird. Weird क्या है? Stubborn. I don't understand the term weird. Complicated, okay. The idea of East and the West. Jay, now this is a problematic zone. because East and the West themselves are a constructs of Western discourse, right? And today you cannot really make clear-cut distinctions between East and the West in a globalized space, right? Our clothing or our whatever, our gadgets, क्या East क्या रहा और West क्या है?
Yes, sir, everything has got mixed. I mean, they are adapting our culture and we are adapting their culture.
Exactly. So it's all hybridization that has happened. So we cannot really posit the idea of pure East and a pure West. Plus West जब हम कहते हैं तो उसके अंदर भी बहुत सारी डाइवर्सिटी है. इटालियन भी है और फ्रेंच भी है और ब्रिटिश भी है, right? So there is a great diversity even within West. Okay, Kritik Sharma asked, does it talk about two self-consciousness within one person, or is it simply like recognition of one self-consciousness depends on other? Yeah, the second part of your question, or ke baad. Recognition of self-consciousness depends on other person's self-consciousness. Master-slave dialect. Is that okay, Kritik? Okay. So what is your response to German idealism in Kant and Hegel? What is your take? What were your experiences when you heard these ideas? How many of you found this too boring? But अब सब क्या करें, क्लास तो अटेंड करना पड़ेगा. You can say so. हेगल ने हम लोगों को फ्रीडम दिया है कहने के लिए. Yeah, Pooja, what's your response? I can't make out from your emoji. Confused, speechless. Okay. Okay. Challenging at times, boring because we can't grasp it. Yes. Agreed. Idea of historicism was new, right? What else? Yes, Tavan, that's true. That's how we started discussing it. Yeah. But you have no option, but we have to grasp it though. So how will you do it? By reading it, right? And finding out those areas which you can't understand. Okay, logic interesting, correct. Idea of consciousness blew my consciousness away, says Jalvi. Okay. So from in next class, we'll come back to our good old Coleridge to show how he is influenced by Kant and Hegel. Okay. Vaishali says it wasn't boring, it required a lot of mental gymnastics. Yes. Revision session. We can have doubt session, not revision session. You don't have that much time. You have to read and come up with questions. I can't stop wondering how he come to write all this. Kya kha ke aata tha? Okay. Mental gymnastics, yes, you have paid fees for that, Vaishali, for mental gymnastics. So that's our story of modernity. Hegel was alienated from. I think you are alienated from Hegel. Hegel का तो पता नहीं क्या है. Interestingly, Habib has inserted a joke here. I don't know if anybody saw this joke. The joke is, and I will stop with that joke, right? Page number 383, right? So he's talking about a question that Jaldi asked, ये सब कैसे लिखा उसने? क्या खा के लिखता था वो? And he attempts to answer it by saying that what in his personal life would have led to all this. To which Habib says it's true that while living in Jena, Hegel impregnated his landlord's wife. One might be tempted to wonder if the three-phase dialectic did not have its origin partly in this dynamic triad of landlord, landlady, and the tenant. How many of you saw this? With wedlock transcending child, engendering an externalization or estrangement of the second phase of the dialectic. Yeah. Okay. So we'll stop on that note, right? Yes, so see you next week with Coleridge and your questions regarding Hegel. Right. And we'll start also extra classes from next week. Yeah. Extra classes start from 2:30 Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday. 2:30 to 3:30. Yes. Have a good day and take care.